Thanks for being here. I'm Selim, and today I'm going to present our paper on connectivity formation of a mobile network. So in the connectivity formation problem, we have a group of robots, here labeled from A to F, scattered over a large area. Each robot has a fixed connectivity radius R. So in this particular configuration, the robot A can talk to the robots B and C, while it cannot communicate with the rest of the robots. The question we ask is, how should the robots move so as to form a connected communication network as quickly as possible? So performing such a motion, in the final configuration, a robot can communicate with the rest of the robots. So before going into details, I would like to first show a practical application of our problem. In this field experiment, the UAVs first take off from their starting locations to start their mission. And at the end of the mission, after they complete it, they would like to form a connected communication network, for example, to exchange the data they gathered during the mission. So in this UAV network, each robot has two modes of communication, the ZigBee and Wi-Fi networks. The ZigBee has a long range but a low capacity, while the Wi-Fi has a shorter range but a higher capacity. So this means the robots can use the ZigBee network to communicate their coordinates over long distances, while to exchange larger data, for example, photos or videos, they need to form a connected Wi-Fi network. The connectivity formation problem was shown to be NP-complete by Anari et al. So therefore, there is no efficient algorithm available to solve this problem optimally. The problem was first introduced in graph settings by Domain et al., where the robots are placed on the vertices of a graph, and then they can only move along the edges. The edge lengths are all the same, and it is the connectivity radius. So in their formulation, the robot's mobility is coupled with connectivity. And for this version of the problem, they introduced a root n factor approximation algorithm, where n is the number of robots. However, their result does not generalize to the Euclidean plane, and it becomes a n root n approximation. The Euclidean plane case was further explored by Anari et al., and then they improved the approximation ratio to be linear in the number of robots. And finally, in this paper, for the case when the initial positions of the robots are chosen uniformly at random, we show that we can have a root n factor approximation, where again, n is the number of robots. So since the initial configuration of the robots is chosen uniformly at random, the density of the initial configuration plays a role in the time it takes to establish connectivity. For example, for dense configurations, this time to establish connectivity is going to be short, while for sparser configurations, it will take a longer time to establish the connectivity. So if the robots are distributed on an environment of side length L, and each robot has connectivity radius R, then we characterize the density level of the initial configuration in the following way. We first place a grid on the environment. So each grid cell has side length R, and there are L by R columns and rows in the grid. So if the number of cells in this grid is smaller than the number of robots, then we are in the dense configurations. And if the number of columns is more than the number of robots, then the configuration is said to be sparse. The density level in between dense and sparse configuration is considered to be a moderate configuration. So we have the L by R ratio, and we can compare it against various functions of n to decide the density level of the configuration. For example, if it's smaller than root n, then the configuration is dense, and if it's larger than some constant times n, then the configuration is sparse. So the algorithm we introduce follows a different strategy in different density levels. So when L by R is smaller than root n, which corresponds to the dense configurations, the algorithm calls the function cluster connect. And for the other two configurations, sparse and moderate, the subroutine star connect is called. So I'll first start with the star connect. It's a very simple algorithm. It first computes the smallest enclosing circle of the initial positions of the robots. And suppose C is the center of this circle and capital R is the radius of it. So the algorithm first finds the robot that is closest to C, here shown in red, and moves this robot to C. And then for the remaining of the robots, the algorithm iteratively moves them towards C until they are connected. And then the resulting final configuration is a connected communication network where the maximum of the movement of the robots is no more than capital R. And the second algorithm, cluster connect, starts with clustering the connected components of the initial configuration and picks a center cluster, here shown denoted by P star. Then it sorts all other clusters with respect to their distances to P star. And similar to the star connect algorithm, it iteratively moves the clusters until the connectivity of the robots is established. So here the theorem 1 summarizes the main result of our paper. So for the connectivity formation problem with the maximum movement minimization objective, we show that we have a root n factor approximation algorithm where n is the number of robots. Our analysis of this theorem consists of 3 cases, one for each density level, and I'll go over these next. So the first case is the dense configuration case. Here we first consider the Euclidean MST, the minimum spanning tree on the initial positions of the robots. So suppose m sub n denotes the length of the longest edge in this tree. Then we have the following observation. The optimal solution cannot be any smaller than m sub n minus r over 2, which corresponds to the case where we are moving the 2 subtrees along the m sub n edge until they are connected. We also know that if we cluster the connected components of the initial configuration, each cluster has a neighboring cluster that is at most m sub n away. And finally, by placing concentric circles on the environment, which are m sub n apart from each other, by showing that the number of rings a cluster has to travel to connect to the P star is bounded, then we show the approximation for this case is root n. So for dense configurations, we have a root n factor approximation. The next case is the sparse configurations. Here we again consider the smallest enclosing circle and denote its radius by capital R. And suppose D denotes the furthest pairwise distance. So we know that D cannot be any smaller than R times root 3, which corresponds to the case where 3 robots on the smallest enclosing circle are in a equilateral triangle formation. So for any other configuration, D is going to be larger. And also from the definition of the connectivity, we know that in the final configuration, the distance between 2 robots cannot be any more than n times r. So then, using these 2 observations, we show that we have a constant factor approximation for sparse configurations. And the last case is the moderate configurations case. Here we are using the largest nearest neighbor distance in our argument, and let z sub n be this distance. And suppose u is the robot whose distance to its nearest neighbor is z sub n. And suppose also that v is a robot that is connected to u in the final configuration. So then we know that in the final configuration, the distance between u and v is going to be no more than r. And the distance in their initial configuration cannot be smaller than z sub n because u's closest robot was z sub n away. Then we know that the maximum movement of these 2 robots, u and v, is going to be at least z sub n minus r over 2, and this constitutes a lower bound for the optimal solution. And we then use an existing result for a lower band of z sub n, and then we conclude that we have a root n over log n approximation for moderate configurations. So our analysis for theorem 1 consists of 3 cases, one for each of these density levels, for which we had at first a root n factor approximation. We also remarked that our approximation gets better as the configuration gets sparser. We also verified our analysis through simulations. So in the simulations we used varying number of robots starting from 10 to 1000 in an environment of side length L equals to 10 and connectivity radius R equals to 1. So the figure here shows the average values of the maximum moment produced by our algorithm. So the blue one is the average maximum moment solution, and red curve is the bound. The plot shows that our analysis holds, and for the values of n larger than 900, the term m sub n minus r in the bound becomes negative, since the initial configuration of the robots is already connected most of the times. So for those instances, our algorithm produces a value of 0, while the bound is going negative. So therefore, we have the bound going below our algorithm solution. So in conclusion, in this paper, we studied the offline connectivity formation problem, where the robots had 2 modes of communication. And then for this problem, we introduced a root n factor approximation algorithm for the case when the initial positions of the robots are chosen uniformly at random. And we also demonstrated our algorithms in field experiments. And as part of our ongoing work, we are studying the online version of this problem, where the robots will have only 1 mode of communication. So here we are removing the dual communication assumption, and in the absence of a central station or a leader robot to compute the final configuration of the robots will need to search for each other. So the robots will need to perform spiral-like space-filling movement patterns to find their peer robots. So we are still actively studying this version of the problem, and I'm happy to take any questions you have about it. And this was my final slide, and I would like to thank all of you and our supporters, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Question? Yeah. Oh, I need
Thank you. So great talk.
Thank you.
So one of the questions I had while going through your talk was that if you consider a nonlinear communication environment in which it seems that you have all constant bandwidth, I was wondering if there's in your grid base you could have different bandwidth variations.
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, we were studying just a linear, I guess, communication model. So we have a fixed range. So the sensor model is designed to be just a disk. So if they are within the disk, they can communicate. But I'm sure there are many interesting application areas, like if we can incorporate the nonlinearity in the communication model. But we've been just assuming a very simple model for the communication. But in our experiments, we verified our assumption, and then in most of the times it was working fine with our assumptions. Thank you.
question? Yes, please.
Yes. your model works for 2 dimensions or for 3, or also for 3 dimensions?
Yeah, it is actually for, it can be modified to work in higher dimensions as well. Yeah, in fact, in our UAV network, they're in a 3-dimensional world, of course, but we were assuming they were on a plane, but there's no, like, instead of, we were computing, for instance, the smallest circle, smallest enclosing circle, right? Now we would need to compute the sphere that is enclosing all the robot's positions. But the algorithms can be modified to perform in those cases as well.
And my question actually is, in your results, you use the ratio between the radius of the area to the radius of the
Connectivity radius, yes.
Okay, these are lengths,
Yep.
but we are talking about space. Perhaps you should use the squares of the radius in your criteria.
For higher dimensions?
Sorry?
Do you mean for the higher dimensions we need to?
Yes, in order to classify the problem sparse or dense, why not using the ratio of the squares of a radius and not just the ratio of the radius, which is a ratio of lengths and not ratio of areas or volumes?
Yeah, I think for this 2-dimensional case, it shouldn't matter too much, like, because we are still encapsulating the density level, like with the ratio L by R. But yeah, we didn't study the higher dimensions, like, so I think for those cases, like, we might need to incorporate the suggestions you had. Thank you.
Oops.
So do you know if there's been any work on this problem with model-based techniques? I'm thinking quadratic programming would look like there'd be a model there, so trying to find exact solutions?
Yeah, I haven't seen any. I was looking, there's some literature in the controls field, but usually they're assuming the initial configuration is already connected, so they're providing some control laws to maintain the connectivity, but to establish connectivity, we need algorithms, and we were studying those. Yeah, but I'll have a look at it for
Okay, thank
the
you.
ones you mentioned as well. Thank you.
I would thank the speaker.
Thank you too.